Alright, welcome back everyone. So in the last video, I showed you a command called sudo, and I wanted to create another video explaining what the purpose of the sudo command was. To start things off, let's go over some basic things. Every Linux distribution, there is a user called root. Now this user is similar to an administrator on a Windows PC, but basically the root user has permission to do anything they want. They can create, delete, and write to any files in the system. They can install and delete software. They can even install viruses and malware. Basically, they have complete control over the operating system. Now, certain distributions of Linux, like CentOS, allow you to log in as the root user, so you can SSH directly as the root user or just log in as the root user. But Ubuntu, by default, does not let you log in as a root user, and this is done for security purposes. In Linux, the command to change to a different user is su and then dash space and then the name of the user. So if we had a user called user1, this would log us in as user1 in the terminal. If you want to log in as a root user, you just leave the username blank, so you just do su dash and you hit enter, and it'll prompt you for the root password. Now, we don't know what the root password is, right? We didn't create it upon installation. There is no default password for the root user, so we cannot actually log in as the root user on Ubuntu by default. Now, you may be wondering, if we can't log in as the root user, how do we perform any tasks that require root privilege, right? And the answer to that is we have the command sudo. The sudo command is the Linux equivalent of running run as administrator or run as administrator on a Windows PC, right? You know, you right click on a certain exe file or a certain application and you click run as administrator. That's going to essentially run that program with root privilege. And in Linux, if you want to do the same thing, you just preface any command with the word sudo. So as an example, let's go to the root directory. So I'm at the root directory and I just want to create a file on the root directory, and we'll just call this new file. And by default, if you want to write, create, delete, or modify any file in the root directory, you need to have root privilege. So if I try to do this, it's going to say permission denied. So to temporarily give myself root privilege, I have to run the command sudo, and then I type in the command that I wanted to run. So touch new file, and that's going to run this command with root privilege. And when I do that, it's going to prompt me for a password. This password is my user password. So I'm logged in as Sanjeev, so I need to put in the password for the Sanjeev user, not the root user. So I'm going to put that in, and you can see here we should have a file called new file. So that's basically how the sudo command works. You just type in whatever command that you normally wanted to run, and you just put in the word sudo before it, and that'll give you root privilege or root access when you run that command. Now, one thing I wanted to show you real quick is, let's go ahead and run the same command, but let's create a new file. So we'll call this new file 2, and when I run that, you notice that we didn't get a prompt for a password this time. So you might be wondering, well, did it work? Did we actually create the file? Well, let's check. And you can see here, we did in fact create the file, but for some reason Linux didn't prompt us for a password. And the reason for this is because when you enter your password in, when you run the sudo command the first time, it creates a sudo session. And during a sudo session, you will no longer have to enter your password every time you run a command with sudo. Now, by default, this sudo session will last 15 minutes. So if we wait 15 minutes and run another command with sudo, you'll see that it'll prompt us for a password again, and we'll have to enter it again. So it's just a mechanism so that, you know, as an administrator, you don't have to want to keep entering in the password over and over and over again. It'll kind of cache your password for 15 minutes and make it so that you don't have to continually enter it in over and over. Now, we can change the default timeout for this sudo session by looking at the /etc/sudoers file. So if we do cat/etc/sudoers, well, we actually need sudo permissions to actually look at the file. So if we do sudo cat/etc/sudoers, this file provides a lot of the configurations for, things like sudo and things like that. What we want to look at is, let's see if I can find the line, defaults environment reset. So after this line, we can actually type in certain parameters to allow us to tweak what the default sudo session time is. Now, to tweak this file, you don't go into your normal text editor like VI or Nano to change it. There's actually a special command that you need to run to change this. And the reason we have this command is that, by making changes to this file, you could technically break sudo access to this operating system. And we don't want to accidentally lock ourselves out of sudo, because then we can't get back into the file to make the necessary changes to fix it. So when you run this special command to modify this file, it'll run some checks when you make any changes to ensure that the changes you made are valid and will work. And if there's some kind of typo or misspelling that could potentially break the configurations, it'll make you aware of those. So the command to actually make changes to this file is visudo. And we need sudo beforehand to actually run the command. And this right now by default is actually opening it in Nano, but when you do it with visudo, you get some extra checks on the back end. And what I was talking about before was changing the default sudo session timeout. So to do that, just scroll to this line, and we're just going to type in comma timestamp underscore timeout equals, and then we can put in the default sudo session timeout value that we want. So if I type in 40, that means that when I enter in a password, when I run sudo for the first time, that sudo session will now last 40 minutes, so I won't have to enter in my password for another 40 minutes. If I select the value of 0, that means it will always prompt for a password. And if I select a value of -1, that means it will never time out. So once I enter in the password once, it'll be in a sudo session just forever. All right, so that's how you change it. And to save the configuration, you just hit Control X, and it's going to say, would you like to save your configuration? I don't want to save it, so I'm just going to hit no. But if you did, just hit the letter Y and it'll save the configuration. Now, let's say you're in a sudo session. So you've run the sudo command once and you've entered in your password. And let's say that you want to let a coworker quickly use your terminal session. Now, why would you do that? I don't know. They can just log in themselves. But let's say you just wanted to let them use it real quick, but you wanted to make sure that they don't have sudo access because you're technically in a sudo session and they could just run any command they want without having to enter in your password. You can technically log out of a sudo session by typing in the command sudo-k. So this will log us out of a sudo session. So if we try to create a new file, we'll call this new file 3, it's going to ask us to enter in a new password. So that's the command that you need to actually just log out of a sudo session. The next command I want to show you with this is that we can actually kind of log into the root user, and we can do that by entering in the command sudo-i. And when we do that, we have to enter in the password for our user. And you can see here we've now changed to the root user. And if we run the command whoami to see who is this user, it's the root. So that is one way to gain access to the root user, and you can technically run whatever commands you want as the root user, and you won't have to use the words you won't have to use the command sudo before every command, but it's in general best practice to avoid doing that. And it's always a security concern to run as the root user, so always just be logged into your specific user and always use the sudo command. So let's exit out of here. To exit out of a specific user's session, I guess, if you want to call it that, you just hit exit, and we get returned back to our normal shell session, and we can just verify that this is Sanjeev again. Now, there's one more thing I wanted to show you with that /etc/sudoers file. Let's say that we get annoyed by having to enter in a password every time we enter sudo. And let's say that we just want to make it by default that we don't need to enter in a password. If we're logged in and we run sudo, it should just run. We can actually change that. And to do that, we run the same vi sudo command, and it's going to take us back to this file. And all we have to do is go to the bottom of the file and type in the name of the user. So my user's name is Sanjeev. And then we type in all equals parentheses all, no passwd all. So if we save the configuration now, you'll see that every time we enter in sudo, we won't need to enter in a password. So that's just something to keep in mind if you wanted to tweak the default settings. But I'm just going to go ahead and delete the changes that I just made. And when I said that there was no way to log in as the root user, I kind of lied. As I said before, there is a root user. It's just by default on Ubuntu, we don't have a password set for the root user. So we can actually go in and set a password for the root user. And to do that, you just run the command sudo passwd root. So what this command is doing is, if you run the command just passwd and then the username, you can change the password for any user. So here we're changing the password for root, because by default there isn't a password. So when you run this command, we'll now be setting a password for root. When we hit enter, it's going to ask for a new password. Just type in whatever you want, and you'll have to retype it. So now we do have a password for the root user. Let's see if we can change to the root user. Now, if you go back to the beginning of the video, I showed you the command to actually change to any user, and that command is su dash and then the name of the user. And if you're trying to change to the root user, you can just leave the user argument empty, and the command line will know that you're trying to change to the root user. So we do that, it prompts us for a password, and we just type that in, and you can see now we're logged into the root user. So that is a way to enable the root user, but as I said, for security purposes, it's best if you just kind of leave things to the Ubuntu defaults, unless you want to do something very specific. So for now, let's exit out of that. And if you have already enabled the root user, to disable the root user again, all you have to do is just type in the command sudo passwd -l root. So that basically deletes the password for the root user, and it goes back to the default. So if we try to change to the root user and we enter in the password that we originally configured for the root user, you're going to see it's not going to work now. Now, let's go ahead and talk about who actually gets access to the sudo command. Now, my user, which is named Sanjeev, has access to sudo, because when we enter in the sudo command and put in our password, it validates and authenticates, and it allows us to run any command with the sudo option. But you may be wondering, well, does that mean any user can do that? Well, the thing is, the user Sanjeev was created upon installation. So right now, that's the only user configured on this Linux box. And so by default, that user will always have sudo access. Now, if we create a new user, let's see if they get root access with the sudo command as well. So the command to create a new user is add user. We'll probably need the sudo option, add user, and then you put the name of the user. So let's just call him user1. And we'll have to configure a password for this user. And it wants a name, and we can just ignore all of that. Is this information correct? Yes. All right, so let's switch to user 1 and let's see if we can run a command with sudo. So to change users, you do su dash and the name of the user, user 1. Enter in the password. So now we're user 1 and we can verify that. And let's see if we can go to the root directory and let's create a file on here, because we know we need root permission to be able to do that. So if we type in sudo touch user 1 file, now we have to enter in the password for user 1, and it says user 1 is not in the sudoers file, and this incident will be reported. So it looks like new users that are created do not get access to sudo by default. Now by default, any user that is part of the sudo group will have access to the sudo command. Now I haven't covered the concept of groups yet. I have a separate video. Actually, my next video will probably be on that. But just to quickly summarize what a group is, basically a group is just a way to organize a group of users, right? It's in the name in itself. So a group is just a collection of users, and you normally want to assign users who share similar permissions into the same group. So that's pretty much the purpose of groups. It's just all about permissions and what files and services and applications that individual users get access to. But instead of modifying individual users' permission, you modify it at the group level, so you can change the permissions for multiple users all at once. But let's go back to the /etc/sudoers file, and I want to show you one line in there, and that's going to explain why the sudo group has access to the sudo command. So let's just do cat /etc. We'll need to do sudo, of course, /sudoers. Oh, that's right. We're still logged in as user 1. So let's exit out of that, get back to the Sanjeev user. And you can see this line right here is saying that any member that's associated with the group sudo can execute any command. So what we need to do is, if we create a new user and we want to give them access to the sudo command, we need to make sure that they are part of the sudo group. So let's go back to user 1. And let's see what groups he's a part of. So right now he's part of a group called user 1, which seems a little confusing, but by default, when you configure a new user, a new group with the same exact name of the user gets created as well. It seems kind of stupid, but that's just the way it works. If we go back to Sanjeev and we run groups, we can see that we also have a group that's named after the user, but we're also part of all of these other groups. And this is the main one that we're concerned with. So we want user 1, when we run user 1 groups, we want it to show sudo. So let's go back to user 1. Whoops. I meant user 1. Actually, we don't actually need to go back to user 1. We're going to make a change from the user Sanjeev, because I actually need root privilege to make this change. But to add a user to a specific group, we have a command user mod -ag capital G and then sudo and then user 1. So let me break down what this command actually means. So to do that, let's look at the man page, or the help option of the user mod command, to get a better understanding of what that command does. So user mod --help. We can also do man user mod, but this is just going to give us a quick summary. And if you remember the options that I gave the -A and the -G. So the -A says it's going to append the user to the supplemental groups mentioned by the -G option. So what this means is that the -A is going to take the user that we give the command and it's going to add it to the groups that are defined by the -G option. So when we do user mod -AG, then sudo, and then user1, what this is saying is take user1 and add him to the sudo group. All right, so when we run this command, well, we got to do it with sudo, of course. After we do that command, user1 should now be part of the sudo group. And we can verify that by changing to user1 and running the groups command. See, now we are part of the sudo group. So if we go to the root directory, let's try to create a file. And now we're going to use the sudo option, user1_file. It's going to ask us for the password, and this is the password of user1, not the password of Sanjeev, not the root password, but the password that I am logged in with, or the password for the account that I am logged in with, which is user1. Yep, must have been a typo. All right, so now if we verify if the file got created, and it did, so this user has sudo access now. So that's everything there is to, well, not everything, but that's going to cover pretty much what you need to know regarding the sudo command. Hopefully that helped clear up any confusion you had with that command. It's pretty straightforward. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and if you have any other further questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. I may answer them, probably not, but you never know.